Thank you for joining us for tonight's We Are Takoma Humanities lecture. Tonight's lecture, The Angie Zapata Story, Transgender Life in American Law, is being presented by Liz Seaton. Liz is an attorney activist, a founding board member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, and has lived in Takoma Park for 23 years. A former staffer at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, the Human Rights Campaign, and in Maryland's Free State Justice, Seaton has worked for many years to end hate violence against LGBT people and secure equality under the law. She is presently writing the book, The Angie Zapata Story, Transgender Life in American Law. Again, thank you for joining us, and with that, I'll turn it over to Liz. Thank you, Liz.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks so much for coming tonight. What I want to do is talk about Angie Zapata's story, and I've called it Transgender Life in U.S. Law because Angie Zapata, who was an amazing young woman who lived a brave, authentic life, changed American law forever. Her life and death story changed American law. And I want to do this talk in 3 parts. And the first one, 10 background facts. I selected them. There are, of course, a lot of different facts we could talk about in American history about the LGBTQ movement and everything that's gone on in the movement. But I wanted to talk about these 10 facts, and you'll see why as I go. In this country, early laws made transgender people criminals. And you can see one example on bill. Dress not belonging, a person was not allowed to wear a dress belonging to discriminate against people. They were used to justify discrimination, violence against people. They really held people back and forced them to conform to societal gender norms, which says a man should be a man and a woman should be a woman, and there's nothing in between. This one of my favorite pictures, Ella Wesner from 1871. Most of the laws were not enacted until a few decades later, but they had their effect nonetheless. This, I think, will be common knowledge, I think, to many people. The Stonewall Rebellion, when LGBTQ people started to fight back. 1969, June 28th, this went on for several days, the Stonewall Rebellion. And there, although I think it wasn't originally commonly known, but some of our historians have done a good job in spelling this out, diverse drag queens, butches, lesbians, gays, and our allies who were also in the clubs with us fought back against police raids. And when I was young, one of the things we were worried about was that police might raid the bar that we used to go to, even when we were in college. And because for all of us who were lesbian and gay, and I came out in the 1980s, our love for each other was illegal, and you could be arrested just for being intimate in your own homes. And that those laws worked against people in all kinds of ways. I did want to note that President Obama approved the Stonewall National Monument in 2016, taking our first historical site and making it a federal national monument. A lot of different things then caused, a blossoming of the lesbian and gay movement. The 1987 Supreme Court case of Bowers versus Hardwick. This was the Supreme Court decision that affirmed those state laws that made it illegal for gay and lesbian people, same-sex couples, to love each other. The HIV/AIDS crisis was, on the rise at that point in time. Originally, obviously, that disease in this country was originally being called GRID, which I can't remember what that stands for. But it was thought to be just a gay disease. Around that same time, lesbians were losing custody of their kids in court. And there was state-sanctioned discrimination. Many states just boldly permitted discrimination against lesbian and gays. State actors themselves would discriminate against lesbian and gay people. Our community responded. We created organizations that lobbied, organized, agitated, and demonstrated, and we cared for ourselves when no one else would. Here's the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. One of the colleagues I used to work with at the Whitman Walker Clinic said, and I will always remember this, she said when she saw this, history will show that our community found beauty even in death. We used all the tools at our disposal, including national marches, Here's two, 1987, 1993. I was at both of these marches with my partner, Pat, who's here tonight. Transgender people stepped up. Transgender people stepped up in a lot of different ways. At that time, many gay and lesbian groups didn't fully advocate for the full range of policy and social changes that transgender people needed. Some groups did, but not all groups did. And over the years, we worked to get them to change their mission statements and their work, to broaden their staff, and to do so much more for transgender people. A lot of us worked for lesbian and gay organizations that did care. I, for example, worked for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. The National Center for Transgender Equality was formed about this time by its executive director, still doing that work today, Mara Kiesling, an amazing advocate and a leading advocate. This was the first transgender organization in Washington, D.C., National Transgender Organization in Washington, D.C. Around this same time, American Boys, which is an organization that was organizing forums and conferences, workshops, informational sessions for transgender people who were on the female-to-male spectrum. I was at one of their conferences here in the Washington area, and we formed the Transgender Law and Policy Institute. This is an important fact, as you will see later. And it was a group of us that are still close friends, still working together today. Shannon Minter, who's the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Jennifer Levi, who is the Transgender Project Director at Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defender. Kyler Broadus, who was for a long time the board chair of the National Black Justice Coalition. James Green, who you'll see featured here a little bit later. Paisley Curra, who is a professor a political science professor at the City University of New York. We formed this organization because at that point in time, there was nowhere where transgender advances in law and policy, fledgling as they were, could be captured. We knew we needed to do more, and we agreed to form this organization, work together, and work across the range of transgender law and policy issues in the years to come, and we did exactly that. We worked for a lot of different lesbian and gay organizations, as I said, and we led internal efforts at those organizations that were really transgender advocacy projects. So for example, I worked at the Human Rights Campaign for 6 years, from 2000 to 2005. This is one of the projects I persuaded HRC to pick up and do. Transgender Americans, a Handbook for Understanding. This, I believe, is the first national professional advocacy piece produced that was then sent to every Congress member. It was also sent to a whole lot of state legislators. And this pamphlet, which I have some copies of, in my attic somewhere, I think it's been outdated since then, although I was flipping through it. What's in this book are pictures of transgender people, mostly by the amazing photographer Lauren Cameron, and they're pictures and stories of who they are and what they do for work and where they're from. And the idea was to put a face on transgender issues, because we could tell from some of the decisions being made by legislators, by judges, other public officials, that they just didn't understand who we were talking about. Other work was being done that told the story. This is one of the first big films. In 1993, Brandon Tina, a transgender man, was raped and murdered in Nebraska. And eventually Hilary Swank won an Academy Award for the film Boys Don't Cry around the same time. And so that was a big Hollywood bonanza. I mean, this story about this kept just flowing out. Tons and tons of people saw this film. And then at the same time, within our own community, people were starting to produce many more scholarly and historical documents that talked about transgender people, the history of transgender people in this country, how we'd always existed, and where we lived, what we did. This is, over on the bottom right, is the cover of Les Feinberg's book. Les Feinberg wrote, this book is called Transgender Warriors. making history from Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman, who was a kind of controversial figure at the time. But it's an incredible book, and I really recommend a read of it. At the same time, from when I moved to Washington in 1988 and through to today, there's an epidemic of anti-transgender hate violence. Though the population of transgender people is actually, it's larger than you think, but not as large as, all men or all women or, whatever demographic you choose. An amazing number of transgender people are being killed. Were being killed then and are being killed now. And most victims are transgender women of color, like Gwen Araujo, who was killed in 2002 in California. Gwen's case, and her mother has spent a lot of time since 2002 speaking out on Gwen's behalf. Gwen's case was the first case in the country. So we had been working solidly, LGBT groups at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, to try to pass laws that would ban killing transgender people, to say that our lives have value, to say that our lives are as precious as anyone else's. And Gwen Araujo, when her life was taken, the prosecutors wanted to do justice in Gwen's case. They brought the case as a murder case, and they brought it with a charge of hate crimes against the killers. And that case, with both of those charges, went to trial. In Gwen's case, one of the problems we had was we had trouble getting police, detectives, prosecutors to care about transgender cases prior to, we had an occasional someone who cared, but mostly these cases would be ignored. Nobody would be found. There really wouldn't be a heavy search for somebody to, for whoever committed the crime. Gwen's story made the national news, and in Gwen's case, the prosecutors focused very much on winning the murder charge. They were very determined that in this case, they would secure a conviction on the murder charge. They brought the hate crimes charge, but it was not their top priority charge. And but it was the first case in the country where a hate crimes charge was brought in the case of a murder of a transgender person. Over the years, we had been advocating as a community for a federal hate crimes bill that would protect LGBT people. In other words, people based on their sexual orientation, whether they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or heterosexual, and based on their gender identity. We had different terms for it over time, but leading up to Angie Zapata's case in 2004, I think it's about 2004, our group, the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, working for and with national LGBT advocacy groups, led the attorney team that defined gender identity in the federal hate crimes bill pending before Congress. In other words, Congress had a bill, and the question is, who would it cover, and using what language? I chaired this committee. Shannon was on it, Jennifer was on it, several other transgender people were on it. There were a lot of lesbian and gay people on it from national organizations, and everybody brought a piece of expertise to this language. At that point in time, Congressman Barney Frank was one of the leading advocates on this bill, and you had to get everything approved through Barney. And we got this definition approved by him finally. He didn't like our first version, but he approved of this one. That same year, along with Angie Zapata, there were 21 murders of transgender and gender nonconforming people recorded. And they were recorded by transgender people who in this year first created a website called Remembering Our Dead, because there was nowhere where transgender statistics or stories were being gathered about how many people were being killed. But with the rise of email, the internet, much quicker communication, stories, what was happening with stories were able to be found and to be spread and to be shared much more quickly. Eventually, the Remembering Our Dead site was turned into the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which occurs every year on November 20th. These are 10 of the stories of people who were killed in that year, and their stories were captured by transgender leaders. And that, that select set of facts, and probably people know a lot more about that who are watching this presentation tonight. But that's kind of where we were as we led into 2008 and Angie Zapata's case, which the formal name of which is People of Colorado versus Ellen Ray Andrade. So one of the quirks of American law is that the title of the case doesn't show the name of the victim in a criminal case. So you can see in all of the legal papers it talks about the people of Colorado who are represented by the elected prosecutor in Colorado and Mr. Andrade. And Angie's name isn't mentioned there, although if you dive into the papers, obviously, there's a lot. Here's Angie at 2 years old on the left, shown here with her brother Gonzalo, who goes by Gonzo. Angie was born biologically male and named Justin. Here Angie is likely 18 years old. Angie, who always felt female, loved to wear her sister's clothes and play with makeup, and walk in high heels, which I didn't put in here, began living as a woman at 16. At this age, when Angie was younger, she liked to do all kinds of different things, but when Angie was around this age, she liked to shop for purses with her best friend. When they were little, they had climbed trees together. I actually remember another story that Rochelle told during the trial where she was just talking about, how much they loved to go shop for purses and how unstoppable Angie was. Her energy was she had overflowing energy. She was full of life and vitality. She loved to go out and do things, and Rochelle feared she couldn't even really keep up. Angie liked her very first apartment where she lived on her own for the first time as an adult. Her job babysitting her sister Monica's kids, who were Angie's nieces and nephews, and her family, her big family. It had not always been easy for the Zapatas to understand what was happening with Angie, but they loved her and came to a place of full support of her. And by the time of the trial, they were quite fierce in their determination to see justice done for Angie. I think I actually might have the month wrong here, but in the summer of 2008, Angie's life was brutally taken. And this is the instrument that Mr. Andrade used to kill her, a fire extinguisher that he took off of her wall. Angie's car was gone. I think it was her mom's borrowed car, actually, and her purse and her cell phone were also gone. This is Angie's mom, Maria. This is sometime later during the case, but I thought the picture told the story. Angie's body was actually found in the apartment floor by her sisters, Monica and Stephanie, who went to find her when she didn't show up for work to babysit the kids. I already mentioned her brother Gonzo, and there was another sister, Ashley. At first, no one knew who killed Angie. There was a huge manhunt. And during this time, I guess looking back for a minute, if people remember when Matthew Shepard was murdered. When Matthew Shepard was found on the fence in Wyoming, he was still alive, and he was taken to the hospital where his life hung in the balance for several days. And in many ways, that time period when we were all waiting to see if Matthew would live or die, that time period is what allowed Matthew's story to grow into a major national news stories, and with his parents at his bedside. In a similar but different way, it was the fact that it took so long for them to find the killer that grew this story into a national story. Because there was, I hate to say this, but this is how it works in the media often. There was suspense, there was a mystery to be solved. Angie's family came forward, and a lot of us were using the case to try to argue for justice for Angie ultimately, and also to educate about transgender people and the value of transgender lives. Well, they caught Ellen Ray Andrade, and you can read this. He was found in Thornton, which is the next town over, the town where he lived, in his apartment complex in the middle of the night. He was sitting there completely inebriated with the door of his car open, blaring music as loud as he possibly could, I would argue probably just begging to be found. And they did find him because a noise complaint was made. But when they figured out whose car it was, the Thornton police arrived there in force to arrest him. This is the prosecutor in the case at that time, Tea Party Weld County, Colorado prosecutor Kenneth Buck, who today is a Republican congressman for Colorado's 4th district. So during Angie's case, and especially at the trial, there's a huge national media spotlight shown on Greeley, Colorado. Court TV ran the trial live. And at the same time, a secret legal team led by the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where I worked, and with the Transgender Law and Policy Institute attorneys, helped shape the story of this case as the case went to trial. And I want to stop here for a minute and just read you a couple of things, because I'm working on a book around this, and there's some just kind of interesting pieces that I've found here. So this is a news story when they didn't know who it was. This is a newscast showing Joe Timkowicz from the Greeley Police Department. Apparently the person knew the individual. We don't know to what degree. We don't know if they were just acquaintances or there was more to it. They were back to the reporter. Detectives say they don't have the evidence to call this a hate crime, but they're not ruling it out. People in the lesbian, gay, and transgender community say that if Angie was targeted for being a man living as a woman, the effects are widespread. Kelly Costello from the Colorado Anti-Violence Project. We often find that hate crimes have a ripple effect, and so they affect everyone who identifies within the community. This was the night that they were doing the memorial service for Angie. And the reporter said, it was a community Angie's friends she said she was happy to be part of. She was just 18 years old. Now, in terms of whether there would be a hate crimes distinction, ultimately that would be up to the district attorney to decide on top of a first-degree murder charge. But first, detectives need to find out who did this so they can determine why they did it. Police say Zapata's car is missing. They're looking for a green PT Cruiser with Colorado license plate number 441ORN. So this is how people identified that it was actually the person connected to Angie's case, was because the police broadcast on the news what car we were looking for, a green PT Cruiser in Thornton, Colorado, at that time, was not your usual Chevy. Can we just, yeah. So that's how they knew. And when Andrade was actually caught, he confessed when he was brought into the police station that night. And he confessed in pretty graphic terms. He talked about, first he tried to pretend, oh, I don't know what this is all about, but he also acknowledged at the very beginning of the interview that when the police came in so thick, he knew something was happening. The person who interviewed him was Detective Tharp from Greeley, who had come to Thornton to do the interview. So there was a lot of information in the background that they already knew. The police already knew as they went to question Andrade. And pretty quickly they managed to talk him into telling the whole story. But before we get to the trial, and before we get deep into the secret legal team story, Judge Kopkow, who was overseeing this whole case, all aspects of it, suppressed the confession that Andrade made as to killing Angie. He had to, because under the law, people have Miranda rights. You've all seen this on television, right? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You have a right to have not to testify against yourself. There's a number of rights wrapped up in Miranda. It's probably some of the most familiar legal language in the country. Partway through the interview, Andrade said he didn't want to talk anymore. And it was that moment at which Judge Kopkow said the interview should have been concluded. The police should have stopped asking him questions. but the detective didn't. The detective kept going. When the detective got Andrade to talk about it, he talked about how angry he was and how what happened was, and not to be, I want to move to what happened at trial and then what happened beyond that, but it took Andrade some very aggressive work with the fire extinguisher to kill Angie. And he didn't have to do it just once. And I'll just leave it at that. At the point in time, before the case went to trial, a lot of transgender people were very focused on this case. Is there a way that we can help in this case? Is there a way that we can also use this case to educate people? One of the people who was doing that was Kelly Winters. Kelly Winters was a local transgender activist in Greeley, Colorado. And she was in touch with our friend Ken Buck, who is an elected prosecutor, the Weld County District Attorney. And Kelly got into a conversation with Ken Buck, and Ken Buck had a whole team that was going to prosecute this case. Michael Rourke, who was his deputy at the time, Rob Miller, who became the lead trial attorney, Brandilyn Nieto. Rob and Brandy were the two trial attorneys who really litigated the case, but leading up to a case like this, there's tons of preparation to get ready. And one of the things you have to imagine, because it's a murder trial, unless a defendant waives a right to a jury hearing the case, all of the lawyers and the judge have to pick a jury to hear the case. So what Ken and his team started thinking is, gosh, how do we pick a jury? How do we pick a jury that can hear this case fairly, that won't be so biased against Angie for being transgender, that the case can't be heard fairly? And they were puzzled about this, and to be honest, there wasn't any information out there for them to really look at that point. There had not been that many transgender murder cases brought, right? We already talked about that. And there just wasn't as much information. Today there's so much more information available, but even 8 years ago, 9 years ago, there was not as much information available about how to talk about transgender people, about how to describe their lives, about how to answer the questions of people who are not so familiar with transgender people. So Ken said to Kelly, well, if we need help with something, it's this. Is it possible to find a jury consultant who knows, who can help us figure out how to pick a jury that can fairly hear Angie's case? Ken was absolutely determined to see justice done in this case, and so was his whole team. And I really respect that, because at this point in time, Ken was either at that time or just about to be a Tea Party candidate for the US Senate in Colorado. And for almost sure, this was not going to play well to his base, how strongly he was going to stand up for Angie and lead his team to bring this case for justice for Angie and for her family. So around this time, this is where we then, this is when we reach our secret legal team. They reached out to us at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Kelly called our office. The Gill Foundation agreed in Colorado, Tim Gill's foundation, agreed to put forward $12,000 or $12,500 to help the National Center for Lesbian Rights hire a jury consultant to help Ken Buck and his team with this case. And no one knew this. This is, I think, possibly the first time it's been said publicly, unless one of my colleagues has talked to people about it. So what we did was hire Sarah Murray, a trial consultant from San Francisco. I mean, we looked around the country a little bit, determined Sarah was the best person. And Sarah is a lesbian, friends with transgender people, worked with transgender people, lived with transgender people, knew transgender people, and was a trial advocate, not an attorney, but a trial consultant. That's what she did for a living, full time. So she knew what we were talking about, but she also didn't know necessarily what exactly the best practices would be in a court case. So to get Sarah ready for us to send her to Greeley to join Ken Buck's team, we brought together some of the people we've already talked about. We got on the phone Shannon Minter, who's the legal director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Shannon is a transgender man, and he had brought some transgender cases, including he had litigated this one very high-profile case, Michael Canteras' case for the custody of his children. Jennifer Levi, who we talked about, who's the transgender project director at GLAAD. Jennifer had been doing some trial work and had some very good success in cases representing transgender people. What we didn't have among our cadre was somebody who'd done a jury trial, but we knew somebody who had done it. We didn't know them personally, but we were aware of their identity. And the person that we wanted to reach out to was Richard Silber, who is a practicing attorney in Washington, D.C., and he brought the Tyra Hunter case. Tyra Hunter was killed in Washington, D.C. some years before, and then left to die on the street when emergency medical care people discovered she was a transgender person. They just let her die. And Richard won a wrongful death case and a huge jury verdict for the family. And he had selected a jury that had won a case, that had bearing on this case for reasons you can see. He had experience doing it when none of the rest of us did. So I called Richard. He, in 5 seconds, agreed to help us. Absolutely, I want to share that. I have had no idea how to go about doing that until now, and I'm so glad you called me. So we got everybody on the phone with Sarah. So I think Richard was here, Shannon was in San Francisco, Jennifer was in Boston, and Sarah was in California, and I was here in Takoma Park, working from home. We got everybody on the phone, and there were really three main, we talked about a lot of different things in a couple-hour call, but a couple of the main things were this. First, Richard was absolutely determined on this point. You have to bring the jury along in understanding. You have to expect that they're going to start out not understanding as much about transgender people, but you're going to be able to build this support over time. Take them with you on the journey. Show them your journey, and show them you care. And show them you care like you care about anyone else who's not transgender. Shannon, I don't have the notes from this conversation. I think they're in my old files at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. But Jennifer and Shannon both talked about the need to present Angie in the way she lived her life authentically as a transgender woman. So as you probably, there were a lot of other details they went into, do it this way, do it this way, do it the other way, but the gist of it was this, and it became very important when Sarah went to Greeley and met with Ken and his team, with Rob and Brandy as they were prepping for trial. For people who don't, at this point anyway, especially 2000, we're talking about the case was being litigated in 2009. At this point in time, people didn't have a lot of language around this, and what the trial team was preparing to do was to present Angie as Justin Zapata initially. They were planning on presenting the case, presenting Justin as with the birth sex that he had been assigned as male. But that's not how Angie lived her life. And it took Sarah some persuading with the prosecution team, who wanted to do the right thing and wanted to win at all costs and listened with all their hearts. I want to give them enormous credit for this, because I think one of the hardest things probably to do if you're a lawyer litigating a big case is not that long before a trial, change the story of your case, alter it to fit a different story than you are planning to tell. But it worked quite beautifully, as a matter of fact, because when the prosecution team agreed with Sarah to go forward with this, it allowed them to talk about Angie as a young woman, as a daughter, as a sister, as an aunt, as a bestie, a best friend, to her friend Rochelle. And It made the whole story of the case more authentic. And one of the other things that Sarah, really talked to the prosecutors about was showing their caring and understanding and acceptance of Angie as they went forward. And so all of that was happening in the background. This is the part that no one knows about and no one has seen, this robust conversation about the presentation of what has become one of the most important cases in transgender law, Angie's case. And it's part of what I wanted to, here we are, storytelling time, although I already went there. Ultimately, these were the verdicts that were rendered. Guilty, first-degree murder. Guilty, hate crime. Guilty, auto theft, and guilty, I've left off the last one, but it was theft, I think it was grand auto, and then the theft of her purse, credit card, wallet, and all of her identity documents. And that's Andrade on the day that was done. I want to, you can only imagine how much pressure Rob Miller felt as he got up to do the closing arguments in this case. And I want to read just a little bit from my book that maybe helps you. I'm trying to give the flavor of this, and you all can tell me if I've succeeded or failed at this. I've started every chapter of this book with a quote told by somebody who loved Angie. This one is from Monica Zapata, Angie's big sister. Everything that Angie wanted to do in life, it's all gone. Now it's all gone because of Andrade. And then this is from, a more intellectual story, intellectual article about how storytelling in cases like Angie's works. Lawyers, storytellers propose implicit endings in their battles of competing stories in the courtroom. And so, as Rob Miller carefully prepared to make closing arguments in a packed Greeley courtroom, he stood on the national stage. Angie's trial had turned into the biggest case of he and Brandy's lives. People packed the courtroom and overflowed it day after day. Those who couldn't secure a seat demonstrated outside or waited there. Court TV live streamed everything, so people could watch it anywhere they had a computer and Wi-Fi. Media coverage flew across the country at lightning digital speeds. Bloggers reported on the case minute by minute from the courtroom. Each evening after court adjourned, several sources posted summaries and their expert, and sometimes less than expert, summaries of the day's events. Rob knew he must stand up and deliver the performance of his life. Tension reigned. No one could predict what the jury would decide. Succeed and justice could be done for Angie. Fail and Andrade would get off light or even leave the courtroom a free man, which was unthinkable. Surely the jury must hold Andrade accountable for the horrific way he killed Angie, his hatred pouring out through his hands into each blow of the fire extinguisher against Angie's skull. Rob probably couldn't bear to think of the devastation that would show on Maria's face and the faces of Angie's brothers and sisters. They were all sitting in the front row. Hope flowed in from outside Greeley. The transgender community watched and waited, tied to their computer screens to see the outcome. So did the state and national hate crimes communities. Across the country, fair-minded folks emotionally invested in Angie's case outcome watched too, and pinned their hopes on Rob's formidable talents. And then I just want to read a little bit from Rob's closing argument, because I think it kind of shows you the way that he was thinking about the case and what story he was trying to tell the jury as we got to this point. First, Rob put the case in context, respectfully and this part is obviously some of my writing, just putting it in context. He put the case in context, respectfully and matter of fact, reaffirming Angie's status as a transgender woman. Then he carefully summarized the facts that he and Brandy had carefully developed through the trial. Criminal laws have what are known as elements, factors that must be evidentially proved elements. For those who are not expert, it helps to know that for each person to be found guilty of a crime, the evidence of the case must be stacked up to meet these elements. In closing arguments, prosecutor Rob Miller argued that Angie's murder was about an unreasonable and deep-seated anger that Andrade unleashed on Angie Zapata because she was a transgender woman. Exactly right. Rob started by invoking our nation's highest laws, people's moral values, and two ideas rolled into one. Engraved in stone in the Supreme Courthouse of the United States are the words equal protection under the law. And that's what this case is about. This case is also about right versus wrong and about protecting all members of our community. Rob packed a lot into the second half of that sentence. He positioned Angie as a member of the jury's community and invoked the jury's responsibility to do right by her. He spoke fluently with his argument in full swing. He needed to bring Angie right into the courtroom, and he did, painting a picture. He stood up for Angie. He stood her up for the jury and persuaded them to see her as Angie's loved ones had, as a beloved sister, aunt, daughter, and friend, just like we talked about. By closing arguments, of course, the jury knew that Angie was transgender. Though they might not have been thinking in quite these terms, Rob and Brandy set it up to unfold this way. They knew her as a person with the courage to live her life authentically. All the family and friends you talked about, this is Rob, you heard testify talking about her being in a boy's body but living as female. And she had been like this from a very early age. She preferred to play with Barbies rather than toy trucks, like most young boys would. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was part of the argument as Rob took them along his journey. As she got older, instead of being called Justin, she asked to be called Angie, and the family got used to it. They constantly warned Angie to be safe. Be safe, because there's people out there that will not accept you, and they might hurt you. She contributed to her family by working as a babysitter. And more. I'll read just a little bit more from this, just to give you a sense. Rob shifted back and forth between human values and the legal rules. You heard and saw what it was like for two sisters who constantly worried about Angie, to one day find their young sister beaten, bloody, and stiff with a blanket stuck to her face from her dried blood. That was a horrific incident for them and an image that would burn into their memory forever. But Colorado law does not tolerate or allow for murder because you hate someone for who they are. In fact, the law is the opposite. In Colorado, the law protects everyone. It protects me, it protects you, and the law protects Angie, all as equal people. And, you know, I could read more of this, but you get the sense. By the time we got here, and I was watching this online from my office here, at home office in Takoma Park. By the time we got here, the jury didn't deliberate for very long. They didn't deliberate for very long. I wanted to read you also, Angie's sister, in helping to achieve this, did something that I've never seen happen in a case before. And her sister, Angie's sister, Stephanie Villalobos, Gonzo is gay, Stephanie is a lesbian, and I don't know them personally because we hired and were involved in this kind of secret legal backstory, we actually stayed very far away from this whole case as it was being litigated. The very last step on this was the High Court of Colorado affirming the verdicts in this case in 2011. And I'm hoping to meet the family, and I've started to reach out to them. But one of the things that the defense counsel did in this case was to try to put Angie back in a box as Justin. They always used the name Justin. They used male pronouns and called Angie he all throughout the trial. When Stephanie got on the stand, I really think this was the most amazing part of the trial, because they kept saying to her, well, did Justin do this or did Justin do that? And every time, Stephanie sitting up there, I mean, looking sad and heartbroken but determined, would say, do you mean my sister? Do you mean Angie? Making the defense counsel answer back every time, yes. Making the defense counsel affirm Angie in her authentic identity as Angie Zapata and as a woman. So, you know, I'll just never forget that. We're in danger of me having lost my clicker here. This is Angie's family at the moment of verdict. This is Monica Zapata. Angie's big sister, who actually died in a car accident a few years ago. This is Gonzo. This family stood up for Angie in so many ways, but that everyone's family would stand up for them in life, not just in death. But this family was just amazing. They spoke out publicly. They worked with the prosecution office, even during their own heartbreak. For the trial wasn't actually that many months after Angie was killed. Angie was killed in the summer, and the trial was in April. It took 6 days. A couple days were jury selection, and then we got to the trial itself. Gonzo, with the family behind him, this was broadcast live on television when the verdict came down, because the national press had been following the story. Gonzo completely broke down while he was reading this statement, and the family gathered around him and put their hands on him, and he was able to continue. They asked Congress to pass the Hate Crimes Prevention Act to protect transgender people. There's more to be told about what happened with Andrade. He was sentenced to life in prison. Then, because he had a history of violent crimes, he was later sentenced to multiple life sentences. This man will never walk free again. But I want to talk here about the pivot to Capitol Hill, which happened, instantaneously in a way that we can only see. We've only been able to see, in the past few decades, really, something shift that quickly. The hate crimes bill was pending. And now we have the huge microphone, but in a whole new location. What Angie's case was the first case in the country where a transgender homicide was found to be a hate crime, by a court of law. Congress had been pondering this hate crimes bill for years, but it hadn't passed it. And I'm just going to tell you, from years of working on it, at the Human Rights Campaign, I worked on hate crimes issues here in Maryland for a while. I worked to try to end hate crimes when I worked at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. There's ways I'm still trying to work on it today. This case provided impetus that otherwise would not have existed. Angie's life and death story made a huge difference. It was used here by activists, by legislators. There was a huge spotlight that was shining on the hate crimes bill. It was in the news all of the time. All of us were writing about it. We were speaking about it. The lobbyists from the National Hate Crimes Coalition were going there all the time. And I really just want to shout out to Michael Lieberman of the Anti-Defamation League, who was the Hate Crimes Coalition chair of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights for many, many years. Michael won an award a few years ago for his work to try to end hate crimes. This is David Stacy with him, who is a lobbyist with the Human Rights Campaign. Judy Shepard, Matt's mom, talked about Angie's story. She'd been talking for a long time and advocating and working with the Human Rights Campaign and other groups and her own foundation, the Matthew Shepard Foundation, to try to get Congress to pass a national law banning hate crimes against transgender people. She talked about Angie's story in the press for passage, and so did Gwen Arajo's mom. I can't even remember what I was going to tell you here, and Angie's case was in April, and the hate crimes law did pass. Angie's fondest dream was to be in the Miss Latina pageant and to become a supermodel. She was absolutely gorgeous. Men would just stop in the store and stare at her, her mother reported. She was hoping for the grand tiara and a professional career as a supermodel. We'll never know if she'll get there. She never got a chance to grow old. She never got a chance to have kids or get married or try out for the pageant or become a, who knows what, U.S. Senator. She never got a chance to do any of those things. But what I want you to know is that Angie Zapata's big, brave, beautiful, authentic life made a huge difference in U.S. law. Without Angie's story, I don't believe that this law would have passed to protect transgender people. The definition of gender identity, when Angie's story was told, was cemented in this bill in a way that it previously hadn't been. Before that, I'm going to tell you, from having worked on this for a long time, that language was kind of untethered. Although organizations were pressing really hard, no one was quite positive what would happen in the final vote in Congress. But it is now enshrined in our US code right here. Angie's name wasn't on the new law. The law was named for Matt and James R. Bird Jr. But her name should be remembered. And I like to think about it this way. This is Angie's piece of the law. Transgender people must be allowed to live. Must be allowed to live. Today we're here. This was a few years ago, actually, 2014, I think. You know, Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black. We're in a whole national conversation about transgender people and transgender rights in our society. And unfortunately, we're still right here. The Advocate reports that to date, in 2017, 24 transgender people have been killed already. And we've got 2 months left to go. That's nearing the top total for a year ever. Tiara Lachey the Boss Richmond, 24 years old, from Chicago, Illinois. The day she died is the day before my birthday. And I guess this is my final point. We've got the law, but we have to change attitudes in society. For we must do more to save precious lives like Angie Zapata's. Thanks so much for being here and for listening tonight, folks. And I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Could be a book.